Again, I'm sorry, my name is Paul. Sorry about the late start. I am one of the social studies instructors here at Penn Foster High School. For those of you who need or want assistance as you're going through your high school program, please know that along with our webinars, that we do have a number of webinars in a lot of different courses. You can use our phone system, our number right here on the screen, 1-888-427-1000. You'll be able to choose the option for academics or instructors and be able to get in touch with either myself, another instructor, or one of our teaching assistants as well to be able to answer any questions you have about your program. On your help and support page on your website is also an email service. When you type in a question, you'll have the option of being able to ask a question, which means being able to send an email to either the education department or our services department, which handles a lot more of technical problems, shipments, payments, things like that. So please be aware that we are available in the when you receive the recording of this webinar tomorrow, along with the webinar, you'll also receive a link to our scheduling website that allows you to be able to select a time that you would like myself or another member of our educational team to give you a call about a lesson that you're having trouble with. That, like I said, will be coming in with the webinar schedule that you'll receive tomorrow. There's also a lot of other assistance that we provide. We do have live help sessions through a lot of our courses. So when you continue to move through your program, you're going to see live help options on your program and courses page. Take a look at that. See when live help's available for your course, and be able to get in contact right there with an instructor. Same thing with our webinars. Like I said, a lot of webinars are available throughout your program. Keep an eye out on that on your message center and the webinar schedule that's available on the program and courses page to be able to see when webinars are available and be able to connect again with myself, the other members of our educational team. In terms of just kind of overall, really helpful hints I'd like to talk to students about, make sure that as you're going through your lessons that you are paying really close attention to your reading assignments. There are objectives available there that can really help you make sure that you're focusing in on the material that is going to be part of your exams, part of what you're going to be quizzed on within your practice exercises, and like I said, on the exams as well. And then as you're reading, take notes based on the objectives. That's a great way of making sure that you are understanding the material that needs to be covered, or that you want to make sure that you cover. And then our practice exercises along with the reading assignments as well. Really great way to make sure that you are covering the material and understanding the material as you're reading. For every practice exercise, like the self-checks, flashcards, discover more activities, those are all geared towards the objectives and all geared towards the material within the reading assignments that we really feel are important. So the better you understand that material and answering those questions, the better off you're going to do with the exam and as you're moving on through the program. In terms of today's webinar, I have three objectives. The first one, that we're going to be summarizing some of the state and local government structures. We'll get into some of the differences between the states of our union. We have the United States is a large country with 50 very diverse states, and so we'll kind of cover some of the differences, as well as the power of the state government. Our founders create a structure called federalism that allows for both the state and the state governments and the federal government to share power, to share responsibilities, and have different powers and different responsibilities. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. If you do have questions, feel free to type them in. If I don't get to them during the presentation, we will have time at the end to cover any questions as well. So starting off with just talking about states in general, and our state governments. If you ever look carefully at the money of our country and some of our larger important buildings in the United States Capitol include this phrase as well, e pluribus unum, and that means out of many, one. And this was a very powerful statement among our founders, that they even saw, even when we just had 13 colonies that became the United States, there were many. There were many different people. There were many different nationalities. There were many different priorities among each, between the states and between the people. And our founders really believed that out of the many groups that made up the colonies and make up this new country, we are going to become united as one. And it's something that we continue to find important as we've gone through American history, and even in today's America, that though we are many different kinds of people, we're a divided country. We have many different perspectives throughout the country. But as a country, we're still one. We are still the United States of America. We are still a country united as a government, as a people. And that, again, just kind of goes back to our founders, that the founders wanted us to be different people, but united. And in terms of our states, like I said, many different kinds of states. We have states like Montana that is large. We have Alaska, Texas, many countries that are on the large size, and some of them having large populations as well. And then we have very small states, many of them in the Northeast, New Hampshire, Vermont, North Carolina, South Carolina are sort of on the smaller side. We have a varying amounts of size of states and also number of people. We have some states that have many millions of people. We have some that have just a few million people. The state I'm from is Wisconsin, and the population of Wisconsin is roughly the same size as the population of just New York City. So just kind of putting that in perspective as well, that some states are the size of some cities, and that's just an incredible part of how different our country and some of our cities and states are. We also have very varying types of history. Our 13 original colonies were obviously part of Britain, part of the many of the colonists came over based on religious persecution, based on wine tolerance, wanting a different form of government. Moving westward, there were those who came to the country just to be able to have a new life, that they wanted to be frontiersmen in the Midwest or in the Great Plains. People who wanted to travel to what is considered our West Coast to have varying economic opportunities. And as the country grew, and as more and more of what we now consider to be the United States, as more of it became part of the United States, again, a much different history. Those who were in Texas had a much different experience becoming part of the United States, having its history. First being part of Spain, then being part of Mexico, being part of France, and then eventually becoming its own country based on from a revolution, a rebellion from Mexico, and then eventually it becomes part of the United States of America. States like California began first again, also as part of Spain, a Spanish colony, became part of Mexico, and again becoming part of the United States after war with Mexico. A lot of differing experiences between states, and again between cultures. Those of Hispanic descent in the Southwest, much different experience becoming part of the United States versus those of New England, in the English colonies. People who went to the upper Midwest that were Western Europeans. Much different experience than many other people of the United States. So many different groups made up our history, make up our country. The people themselves, many different ethnic groups, different religions, different perspectives, a lot of differences amongst our country, but again, united as one within the United States. And then finally, economics. Many different states, like the state of California, has such a large economy that it's actually, as its own entity, as its own state, would be in the top 10 in economic development in the world. That's a phenomenal idea, that just individual states having so much economic power, having so much going on within the country or within the state, versus other states that have primarily maybe a few businesses, or having agriculture as its primary form of government, or not form of government, form of economy. Many states have done very well since the recession in 2008 and 2009. Some states have not. Some states are still trying to build up their industries. Some states are moving away from sort of traditional industries and moving to different ones, moving to different factories, moving to different services. So much changes have come in the last 10, 15 years, 20 years even, in many parts of the country as well, based on the state's economics and based on what the people are able to do and what businesses are able to go into those societies, into those states. So each of our state governments actually created their own constitution. The states are actually required to create their own constitution before they become part of the United States, part of the UN, become a state in the Union, I should say. And for the most part, these constitutions are actually much longer than the Constitution of the United States, of the federal government, primarily because of the specific services that they do provide, that they have to provide within the state constitution, and also the state constitution spells out what kind of local governments are allowed within their state. The federal government doesn't have to do that. When our founders created the U.S. Constitution, it was very much a general document that it created our government, it created our Congress, our president, and our judiciary. But so much was left to interpretation. So much of the power, so much of the work that is done at our federal government has been just established was established because someone needed to do it. So much of our foreign policy has been set up not because of the Constitution, but because our president, our Congress said, well, we have to do it this way. We have to make our government work. We have to be able to make deals with other countries. So much of the services that our federal government does now was not doing at the beginning of our Constitution, at the beginning of our government. It has been established by the federal government to make sure that Social Security was a right of our retirees, that Medicare was a right of our retirees, that different services that the federal government wasn't initially doing established it because that was a service that the people of the government wanted to set up, wanted to take on. At the state level, that wasn't the case. They've basically been able to create what services they wanted to establish within their states, and that has been written into the Constitution. All of the constitutions, all the state constitutions do require a bicameral legislature, so every state is going to have a state senate and a state assembly. Sometimes they're going to be a little bit differently named, but in general, those are the names of those governments, or of the legislature. The Constitution of state governments also create the Bill of Rights. Many states actually have much longer bills of rights, the rights of the people within the state. They more specifically spell out rights rather than in the U.S. Constitution Bill of Rights. The state Bill of Rights, again, tend to be longer, tend to be more specific. State governments also have to run the census of their state every 10 years. And if you've listened to my webinars before, the term census has come up several times. The census of counting the number of people in a state is the responsibility of each state. And it's important to be able to know the apportionment of the state, meaning how many representatives will come from or will go to Washington from each state, and that depends on population. So in order to know how many representatives the state of Pennsylvania will get, there has to be that census. There has to be the counting of the number of people in Pennsylvania. And that's going to happen. That happened in 2010, and that'll happen again in 2020. A census. And then after the census, the apportionment happens, that the state government then looks at the numbers, looks at where people are living, and then apportions those representatives to know how big how big the district will be for each member of Congress. And that leads us to our first poll question. In what way are the state and federal constitutions different? Is it the Bill of Rights? Is it the specific services that are written into the Constitution? Or is it the bicameral legislature? How are the state and federal government constitutions different? All right, thank you so much. Give you guys another 5 seconds. Okay, thank you. So, absolutely correct that it was the specific services are not referred to in the federal Bill of Rights or the federal Constitution. It is in the state government. Moving along to some of the more specific state responsibilities. In the U.S. Constitution, it does specify that any power not given to the federal government should be given to the states. Now, this is one of those more generalized statements that is in the U.S. Constitution. As I mentioned before, much more broad Constitution at the federal level. But in general, yes, the states are given power that the federal government is not specifically given in the Constitution. So what does that power include? They're able to establish their own state criminal code, and it's their responsibility to follow it. So any law that the state government or local government sets up, they then have to enforce it with state-level police, state troopers, state police, and then local troops, or I'm sorry, local police. They also get to regulate industries and businesses and public utilities, and that can go along with environmental protections in terms of what rules businesses, companies have to follow. The federal government also has sets of regulations, but the state government is also able to set it up. And if they feel that the federal government does not go far enough in types of rules, such as the minimum wage for employees, many states have actually gone beyond what the federal government requires and set up their own minimum requirement, minimum wage. Same with some environmental standards. Since President Trump removed the United States from different environmental agreements, removed some regulations on the environment and on emissions from factories, some states have decided that they're going to enact their own specific regulations. So companies in certain states will have to follow the emission standards, follow the minimum wage standards set by the state, rather than just be able to follow what the federal government requires. Each state also regulates their own elections. This was an issue that came up last year in the presidential election and the election in general. And it recently came out that the Russian government did try to infiltrate, try to sabotage some of the elections within the states, and they weren't, as far as we know, able to do that in part because each state has their own rules. Each state has their own way of running their elections. And that became very complicated for the Russians and really anyone else to be able to interrupt the results of our election. The state is also in charge of the public education system. The federal government will establish their own standards, like the No Child Left Behind, like Common Core standards of the Obama administration. But it's up to the states to actually implement. It's up to the states to actually implement the standards from the federal government, implement the requirements that the federal government requires. They're able to set themselves up. Again, they can go beyond what the federal government wants, but they cannot go under. They cannot, they cannot make it, they can't allow a high schooler to only add and subtract, for instance. They have to follow the requirements within the federal regulations and federal law. The state government also has to look out for the general welfare and infrastructure of their state. So, federal highways have to be managed by the state government, as well as welfare systems like Medicaid, Medicare are also they are implemented at the state level. There's also the stipulation that the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is the law of the land. As I said, the state government can go beyond sometimes what the federal government wants, but they cannot go under. They cannot make greater limits than the federal government requires. Moving on to a brief information about the branches of government. Pretty much is exactly the same setup as at the federal level. There is a legislative branch, much like I mentioned before. There sometimes names may vary. Typically, the upper house at the state level is called the Senate. However, its lower house can sometimes be called the House of Delegates or an assembly. But they are generally the same as at the federal level Congress, which has the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The chief executive at the state level is the governor. Their second in line is the lieutenant governor, much like the president and vice president at the federal level. And just like at the federal level, the lieutenant governor tends to have very little power, except in the cases when the governor wants them to have specific powers. There's no specific powers that the lieutenant governor has to have, except in the cases that they replace the governor if that person is not able to assume their duties or is removed from office. There's also the judiciary. And just like at the federal level, there are varied levels within the state court level, or in the state court system. There are the courts of limited jurisdiction. They have, they're basically set up to have small claims courts, so cases that have some money involved. Traffic court, so when you get a speeding ticket, when you run a red light, you may be asked to go to one of these courts of limited jurisdiction. And then juvenile court. So as a minor, those people would be going to court in that limited jurisdiction. The other form of courts at the state level are general jurisdiction courts. And those have different types. The two main ones are civil, in which there is property involved or there's a breach of contract. And then also criminal court, and that's where you have cases of actual crimes, misdemeanors and felonies. And when trials are set up, and this is something that is talked a little bit about in terms of the investigation into Russian hacking and the possibility of people involved in the Trump campaign being involved with the Russians. We're actually hearing a lot about some of these things already. including an indictment by a grand jury. The grand jury is the group that is going to evaluate whether or not there's evidence for an indictment, and they get that information from a prosecutor or special prosecutors. And the prosecutors are going to inform the grand jury, which is typically citizens, typically those who citizens within the community, that the prosecutor will go to them and say, "This is my evidence. These are the warrants. These are the things that I want to be able to search and ask for." And the grand jury will say yes or no based on the evidence, and then they will also choose for indictments, choose for arrests based on the evidence that is collected. Once a person is indicted, there are pre-trial hearings. This will decide if there are plea bargains, if there's going to be a deal between the prosecutors and the defendants, those who are the indicted. And they're also just talking about evidence. Pre-trial hearings will sometimes say, well, is certain evidence allowed within the case? As I mentioned, plea bargains can also be part of this process as well. If a defendant doesn't want to go to trial, they can then make a deal with the prosecutors to not have a trial, and then the judge will simply listen, decide how long that person is going, what that person is going to serve. If it's going to be jail time, if it's going to be some type of other punishment. If the case goes to trial, then that's when a jury that we typically see on court shows like Law and Order, Chicago Justice shows like that, in which there are the 12 jurors who actually listen to the evidence, listen to the attorneys, listen to testimony. If a person is found guilty, they do have the right to appeals. They can go to appeals courts to say, well, I should not have been found guilty because of these reasons, either issues with evidence or issues with how the case went through, or how the jury, information about the jury, information about the previous judge. All those things can be part of the appeals process. And that brings us to our next poll question. What is the purpose of the grand jury? Is it to decide innocence or guilt, or is it to decide if there's enough evidence for an indictment? Give about 5 more seconds. Okay, thank you. So absolutely correct that it is the whether or not there's enough evidence for an indictment. That is the job of the grand jury. The jury that we typically hear about, again, is the one that will decide guilty or innocent based on how the evidence is presented by the attorneys and how the judge deals with the case. The last slide that we'll go over, and then I'll be more than happy to answer questions, is looking quickly at our county and city governments. So at the county level, the two main forms of government are either county supervisors or commissioners. They will deal primarily with taxes, with the debt of the county, how to deal with if there is debt, how to deal with that, and then also implementing national and state programs. So anything that is voted on by our Congress, signed by our president, or at the state level, passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, it then goes up to the county supervisors and commissioners to implement those programs. The supervisors and commissioners are typically directly elected by the people of the county. In some cases, they will either be voted by the whole county, so each individual has to run in the entire county and be elected. In some counties, usually the larger, more populated counties, the commissioners will only represent part of the district, or part of the county, I should say. So if there are 5 commissioners, for instance, each one will have a fifth of that county to represent. At the local level, the study unit, the reading assignments, goes over the 3 primary kinds of city governments. The first one, and the oldest one, is the mayor and council city government. And they represent basically the executive and legislative branches. The mayor is the chief executive of the city, and the council is the legislative branch. And they run very similarly to the government at the state level and at the federal level. There's also the commission, which essentially is a group of officials. They get to divide up the responsibilities of the departments. So they act as both the executive and the executive and the legislative branch. That they will all vote on laws or vote on rules, but then it's a specific commissioner who will execute that rule or execute that law. The third form of local government is one that has a city manager. And the city manager, it would be one that is hired as a private citizen, is hired by a council, a city council that is elected. So it essentially is a indirect form of democracy in which the people will vote for the city councilman, and then the city councilman will then vote on or hire a city manager as the executive administrator for that city. Which brings us to our last poll question. Which form of the city government merges both the legislative and executive branches into one group? Is it the commission? Is it the city manager? Or is it the mayor and council? About 5 more seconds. Okay, thank you. So absolutely correct. That is the commission. So the commission, the commissioners are the executives, and they also will vote for or will execute on specific policy or specific parts of the government, while the whole group will actually vote for or against certain rules. So thank you all for your participation. Are there any questions that I can help out with?